I had just eased my freshly restored fishing boat down the ramp, the morning sun glinting off its polished hull, when the shrill sound of Karen's voice cut through the air. 911, yes. I'm reporting an illegal boat launch. She barked into her phone, eyes locked on me like she'd just caught a bank robber. Behind her, 2 HOA board members stood smirking, arms crossed, already savoring their little victory. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens echoed across the lake. Neighbors gathered, whispering. Karen straightened her blazer, ready to watch me get hauled away. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a small leather case, and flipped it open. The gold letters gleamed State Marina Inspector. The color drained from Karen's face, because in that moment, she realized this wasn't just about my boat. This was about her reign over the lake ending today. My name's Tom Harris, 54 years old, semi-retired, and for the first time in my life, I thought I'd found the perfect place to slow down. After spending 3 decades working as a marine safety officer, a job that had me traveling from coastal ports to mountain reservoirs, I was ready to trade in the constant chaos for something quieter. That's what drew me to Clearwater Shores, a tucked-away lakeside community in the northern part of the state. From the glossy real estate brochure, it looked like something straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Weathered wooden docks stretching over still blue water, sailboats drifting lazily in the breeze, and neighbors who supposedly waved at each other from their porches. I bought a modest 2-story home with cedar siding, perched right on a gentle slope leading to the lake. The property came with one key feature that sealed the deal: deeded rights to a private dock. For a man who spent his life on the water, that was like owning a little slice of paradise. In the early weeks after moving in, life really did feel peaceful. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on the deck, watching loons dive for fish, and my afternoons tinkering with my old fishing boat, a classic 20-foot runabout I'd been restoring piece by piece for years. In the evenings, I'd take long walks along the shore, greeting the occasional dog walker or kayaker. And then, I met her, Karen Whitmore, president of the Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association. Mid-50s, immaculately coiffed hair, a wardrobe full of pastel cardigans, and a voice that could carry clear across the lake even without a megaphone. She had the sort of handshake that was firm enough to assert dominance, but just short of friendly. The first time we met, she introduced herself not by her name, but by her title. "I'm the HOA president," she'd said, as though announcing royalty. "We like to keep a tight ship around here." I remember thinking that was an odd way to put it for a landlocked neighborhood, but given my background, I understood the expression. Still, there was something in her tone that made it clear the tight ship wasn't about order, it was about control. At first, our interactions were cordial enough. She'd drop by with newsletters detailing HOA updates, which were essentially lists of new rules or reminders about old ones. No lawn ornaments without approval. Trash bins must be stored out of sight within 15 minutes of pickup. No exterior paint colors outside the approved palette. None of it bothered me much. My focus was on the boat. After all, restoring her had been my dream project for nearly a decade. The oak trim was polished to a deep honey glow, the hull freshly painted in navy blue with a crisp white stripe, and the motor purred like a contented cat. I wasn't about to let a few neighborhood quirks ruin that. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice the way Karen's eyes lingered on the dock every time she passed my property. She'd slow her stride, tilting her head slightly, as if mentally measuring something. One afternoon, I caught her taking photos of it from the walking trail. When I waved, she didn't wave back, just turned and walked briskly away. I figured she was just nosy. In most communities, there's always one neighbor who wants to know everybody's business. Then I started hearing whispers from others in the neighborhood. A retired couple down the street told me Karen once fined a family for hanging a hammock between 2 trees without written permission. Another guy mentioned she'd tried to stop him from planting sunflowers in his front yard because they were too tall and obstructed the view. The more I learned, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just nosy, she was territorial. And the lake, in her mind, was her kingdom. It was during a casual conversation with my next-door neighbor, Jim, that I first got a glimpse of how far she'd go to protect that kingdom. "You planning to launch from your dock?" Jim asked one Saturday as we were both out raking leaves. "Yeah," I said. "That's why I bought the place. My deed says I've got full docking rights." Jim chuckled grimly. "Well, you might want to brace yourself. Karen doesn't like private launches. Says it sets a bad precedent." I remember laughing then, assuming it was just another harmless HOA quirk. What's she gonna do? Call the cops? Jim just raised his eyebrows in a way that made my laughter fade. She's done it before. I didn't realize at the time how literal he meant that. Still, I wasn't looking for a fight. All I wanted was to enjoy my boat, maybe take a few friends fishing, and spend the rest of my days in peace. The water had always been my escape, the one place where noise, politics, and nonsense couldn't reach me. Unfortunately for me, Clearwater Shores wasn't like the open ocean. Here, nonsense came dressed in a pastel cardigan and carried a clipboard. Looking back now, I can see the signs of what was coming. The lingering stares, the whispered warnings, the faint but unmistakable scent of power plays in the air. At the time, though, I figured it was just neighborhood gossip. After all, I'd spent my life dealing with bureaucrats, contractors, and stubborn harbor masters. One HOA president didn't scare me. I was wrong, because the moment I lowered that boat into the water, I'd find out just how far Karen was willing to go and just how much power she thought she had over me. And she'd find out I wasn't just some retiree with a fishing hobby. I had a card in my wallet that could change everything. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. It was a crisp Thursday morning in early spring when the trouble officially began. I'd been waiting weeks for the weather to break, for the lake ice to fully melt and the water to warm just enough to test my boat without worrying about damage to the engine. That morning, the sky was a pale blue brushed with thin clouds, and the air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. Perfect launch conditions. I was in the driveway, tightening the last straps on the trailer when I heard the unmistakable click of heeled shoes on pavement. Karen. She approached like a ship cutting through calm water, steady, deliberate, and with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Morning, Tom," she said, her voice lilting just enough to sound polite, but with a sharp undertone. Going somewhere, I gestured toward the boat, planning to take her out for a quick spin. Been working on her all winter, and I want to make sure everything's running smooth. Her gaze slid over the boat, lingering on the polished wood trim, before snapping back to me. "You've submitted your launch request to the HOA." Then I frowned. "Launch request, yes," she said matter-of-factly, as though this were common knowledge. "All boat launches must be approved by the board in writing, at least 2 weeks in advance. It's in the community guidelines." I'd read the guidelines cover to cover the day I moved in, something most people probably don't bother with. There was nothing about private dock launches requiring approval. The only restrictions I'd seen involved noise ordinances, speed limits within the no-wake zone, and prohibitions on commercial activity. "I don't think that applies to me," I said carefully. "My deed says I have full rights to my dock and the water access. It's not a shared facility." Her lips thinned. "Tom, those rules are there for a reason. If we let one person launch without oversight, then everyone will want to. We have to keep the lake orderly." I tried to keep my tone even. "Karen, the lake is public water. The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over it. And I'm not exactly new to boating safety." That last part wasn't a boast, it was a fact. But it might as well have been a challenge. I saw the flicker in her eyes, the tiny tightening of her jaw. "I'm going to have to bring this up with the board," she said finally. "You might think you're exempt, but the rules apply to everyone." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back down the street, her phone already in hand. At the time, I figured she'd just send a strongly worded email and leave it at that. I've dealt with plenty of bureaucratic types before they puff up, throw some paper around, and then move on. I underestimated her. The very next day, I found a bright orange envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a notice of violation from the HOA, citing me for attempting to launch a watercraft without prior board authorization. It threatened fines of $100 per day if I continued non-compliant behavior. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. The HOA had no legal standing to enforce such a rule on a private dock. Still, I didn't want this to snowball, so I wrote a polite letter back, explaining the deed rights and referencing the county's marina regulations. 3 days later, another notice appeared, this time marked "Final Warning." By now, it was clear this wasn't about rules. It was about power. Karen didn't like the idea of someone in her community exercising independence without her blessing. Things escalated from there. She started sending mass emails to the neighborhood listserv, claiming that certain residents were putting the lake's ecosystem at risk by launching without inspection. She didn't use my name, but everyone knew who she meant. I'd pass neighbors on my morning walk and feel the shift in their body language. Some would nod sympathetically. Others would avoid eye contact altogether. Then came the petty stuff. One morning, I found my trash bins knocked over, contents spilling across the driveway. Another day, someone left a printed copy of the HOA guidelines in my mailbox, with the boat launch section underlined, even though it didn't say what they thought it did. I started to get the feeling that Karen wasn't just annoyed, she was laying the groundwork for something bigger. My suspicion was confirmed a week later when I went down to the public ramp, planning to launch from there instead of my dock. Just to avoid drama, Karen was already there, parked sideways across the ramp in her SUV, blocking it completely. She rolled down her window as I pulled up. "Ramp's closed for maintenance," she said with a little smile. I looked past her. There were no cones, no barriers, no maintenance crew, just her. "Funny," I said. "The county website says it's open." She shrugged. "Guess they forgot to update it." I could have called the sheriff right then, but something in me decided not to. Not yet. Instead, I backed up, gave her a polite wave, and headed home. If she wanted a game, I'd give her one, but I'd play it on my terms. That was the day I realized this wasn't going to fizzle out. This was the first real spark the moment the quiet life I'd come here for started to unravel. And I had a feeling the fire was just getting started. After the public ramp incident, things didn't just heat up, they started to boil. It was like Karen had taken my decision to launch that boat as a personal declaration of war. And, in her mind, the only logical response was to tighten her grip on anything she could possibly control. The first week after that, I found not one, not two, but 3 more envelopes taped to my front door. Each one was more aggressive than the last. Violation of HOA environmental protection standards, failure to comply with launch safety review procedures, and my personal favorite, obstruction of community harmony. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or frame that one. One morning, I stepped out to get the paper and found a bright yellow notice to cease all dock activity zip-tied directly to my dock railing. It flapped in the breeze like some kind of war flag, visible to anyone walking along the shoreline. It wasn't just paperwork either. She was making sure the social pressure built right alongside the official warnings. Neighbors I'd chatted with just weeks before now kept their conversations short. Invitations to the Friday night potluck on the community lawn mysteriously stopped showing up in my mailbox. Even Jim, my easygoing next-door neighbor, admitted over the fence one afternoon, "She's got the board convinced you're trying to set some kind of precedent, that if you do it, everyone will start." I chuckled bitterly. "You mean, launch their boats legally?" He shrugged. "Karen's not worried about legal. She's worried about control." But Karen's campaign didn't stop at notes and whispers. She started showing up in person, always unannounced, always with that clipboard in hand, making inspections. One Saturday morning, I was sanding the dock railing when I heard her voice behind me. "Just checking for structural compliance," she said, jotting something down without even looking me in the eye. "It's fine," I replied flatly. "It passed inspection last year when I bought the place." She murmured, pen scratching furiously. "We'll see about that." It was petty, childish, but it was working. She was building a narrative, one where I was the unreasonable newcomer threatening the integrity of the community. The tipping point came a week later. It was a calm Sunday morning, the kind where the lake looks like glass and the air feels like it's holding its breath. I'd decided I wasn't going to let her dictate my life any longer. My plan was simple: launch quietly from my dock, enjoy a few hours on the water, and be back before anyone noticed. I'd just hooked the winch strap to lower the boat when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I turned to see Karen's SUV crawling up the shoreline access road, her window down. She had 2 other board members in the car with her, both wearing expressions that could curdle milk. She stopped a good 10 feet away, leaned out the window, and called out, "You know this is a violation, Tom." I sighed. "We've been through this." "Karen, my deed says doesn't matter," she snapped. The board voted last night to prohibit all launches until further notice. Environmental review pending. I couldn't help but laugh. Environmental review. Karen, the lake's been here longer than any of us. The fish don't care what your board votes on. Her face hardened. You think this is a joke? We're protecting this community from selfish, reckless behavior. The 2 board members nodded solemnly, like disciples at a sermon. And then she reached for her phone. "I'll call the sheriff," she said, "and we'll let him decide." I didn't flinch, didn't even pause the lowering of the boat. "You do that," I said calmly. Her mouth twisted into a smug little smile. "Oh, I will, within minutes." She was speaking loudly into the phone, making sure every word carried. "Yes, officer, we have an individual launching a boat without authorization. Yes, it's a safety hazard. Yes, we're requesting immediate response." Her tone was dripping with self-satisfaction. This was the moment she'd been engineering for weeks. But I wasn't about to give her the grand victory she wanted. Instead of arguing, I finished lowering the boat into the water, gave the bow line a gentle tug to make sure she was steady, and stepped back onto the dock. My mind was already working 2 steps ahead. By the time I heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance, a small crowd had gathered along the shoreline path. Neighbors craned their necks to see. Some had their phones out, recording. Others whispered, eyes darting between Karen and me like they were watching a tennis match. Karen straightened her blazer, smoothed her hair, and gave me a look that said, "Checkmate." I just smiled, because what she didn't know, not yet, was that I'd already prepared for this exact moment. She thought she trapped me. She didn't realize I was the one holding the real power in this little game. The police cars were getting closer, their sirens echoing across the lake. Karen leaned casually against her SUV, ready to bask in the glow of her victory. But she had no idea that the rules she'd been hiding behind were about to turn against her. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of what Karen had pulled. I'd seen her kind before. The ones who confused persistence with righteousness, but because I'd decided it was time to end this, once and for all. Her entire campaign against me was built on bluster, and I knew if I could pull the right thread, the whole thing would unravel. The next morning, I went into my study and dug out a manila folder from my desk drawer. Inside were copies of my property deed, the title transfer documents, and, most importantly, a laminated card from my years as a State Marina Inspector. I'd kept it as a memento after stepping back from full-time work, but my inspector credentials were still valid for occasional contract assignments with the state. That little detail might just be the ace up my sleeve. But before I played it, I wanted to be sure I had the full picture. I started with the Clearwater Shores HOA charter. I'd skimmed it when I moved in, but now I read every line like a lawyer prepping for court. I highlighted anything to do with docks, launches, and community facilities. The language was clear. The HOA could regulate the use of the community dock, but they had no authority over privately deeded docks. My dock was named specifically in my property's easement rights. That alone was enough to dismantle her entire board approval nonsense. But I wasn't stopping there. Next, I pulled up the county's marina regulations. I'd worked with the very department that wrote them years ago, so I knew where to look. Sure enough, the rules made it plain any waterway connected to the state's public water system fell under state jurisdiction, not an HOA's. And then I found the golden nugget. Buried halfway down the county's online archives was a PDF from 3 years ago, a notice of violation issued to none other than Karen Whitmore. The charge: unauthorized modifications to the community dock without a permit. I leaned back in my chair, smiling. That explained a lot. I remembered a few weeks ago when I'd seen her down at the dock with a couple of hired workers. They'd been bolting on a small extension, probably to accommodate her pontoon boat. If she'd done that without approval once, there was a good chance she'd done it again. I needed proof. That afternoon, I grabbed my camera and strolled casually down to the community dock. A few people were out fishing, but the place was otherwise quiet. I walked along the edge, snapping photos of the structure, the newer planks that didn't match the original wood, the unsealed posts driven into the lake bed, even the electrical conduit that clearly hadn't been installed to code. From the angle of the bolts and the type of fasteners, I could tell this was amateur work. Not dangerous yet, but certainly unapproved. When I got back home, I dug deeper. The county's building permit database was public record. I typed in Clearwater Shores HOA and hit search. Nothing in the past 5 years for dock modifications. Nothing for electrical work. Either. Bingo. This was the crack in the armor I'd been looking for. Karen had spent weeks painting me as some rogue boat launcher ignoring the rules, but the truth was, she'd been violating the law in plain sight. I decided to make one more phone call before setting things in motion. Marina Enforcement Division. "This is Daniels," came the voice on the other end. "Hey, Daniels, it's Tom Harris." I said, "Got something you might want to see." We'd worked together years ago, and I knew he had no patience for people playing fast and loose with waterfront regulations. I explained the situation carefully, leaving out the personal drama, and told him about the unpermitted modifications. He didn't even hesitate. "Send me the photos and the address. If what you're saying checks out, we'll handle it." I hung up, a slow grin spreading across my face. Over the next few days, I kept my head down. I didn't launch the boat. I didn't respond to Karen's snide remarks when we crossed paths on the walking trail. Let her think she'd won. Let her relax her guard. Meanwhile, I compiled every piece of evidence I had: the HOA charter clauses, the county regulations, the violation notice with her name on it, and the time-stamped photos of the dock. By the time I was done, the folder was so thick it barely closed. This wasn't just going to be about proving I was in the right. This was going to be about showing Karen, the board, and every neighbor watching that the rules she wielded like a weapon could cut both ways. I knew Karen's personality well enough by now to predict her next move. She'd want to make a spectacle of my defiance the next time I tried to launch. She'd want witnesses. She'd want her little audience. Good. I wanted them too. The plan was simple: pick my launch day, make sure word got out so she'd be there, and wait for her to pull her usual stunt. But this time, when the police arrived, the entire game would flip in an instant. As I closed the folder and slid it into my desk drawer, I felt something I hadn't felt since my days on the job: that quiet, confident certainty you get when you know the facts. The law and the truth are on your side. Karen might have thought she was running the show, but she'd forgotten one crucial thing: I'd spent my life enforcing the very rules she was pretending to know. And soon, she'd find out exactly what that meant. The day Karen decided to make her final move was one of those perfect spring mornings: calm water, warm sunlight, and just enough breeze to keep the air crisp. I had a feeling she'd pick that day. Word travels fast in a small lake community, especially when Karen is the one doing the talking. By 9 a.m., my phone was buzzing with text messages from neighbors. "Karen says she's going to stop you today. Heads up the board's meeting at the ramp." Dude, whatever you're planning, don't get arrested. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I loaded the boat like I'd done 100 times before cooler stocked. Life jackets neatly stowed, deck glistening from a fresh rinse. The air smelled faintly of pine and gasoline. That particular scent you only get when an outboard motor is primed and ready. Around 10 a.m., I backed the trailer down toward my dock. The creak of the winch and the gentle splash of water against the hull were oddly calming. Today wasn't about fishing or cruising. Today was about ending this. And right on cue, I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Karen's SUV rolled into view, immaculate as always, chrome trim catching the sun. This time she wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members sat in the back seat, and in the passenger seat was her closest ally, a man named Bill Simmons, who fancied himself the HOA's enforcer. She parked with deliberate precision, angling the SUV so it partially blocked the narrow community path that ran alongside my property. The message was clear: she was here to control the stage. Karen stepped out, clipboard in hand, hair sprayed to a helmet-like finish. Her lips curled into a smile that was half victory, half rehearsed for the cameras she knew would be watching. "Good morning, Tom," she called, her voice sweet as artificial sugar. Planning to violate the board's orders again, I kept my eyes on the winch, just enjoying my property rights. That's not what the rules say, she countered, striding toward me. You were told in writing that all launches are suspended pending environmental review, and yet here you are, ignoring community governance. Bill Simmons chimed in. You're putting everyone at risk. Harris, the lake can't handle this kind of reckless behavior. I bit back a laugh. Reckless. I've been operating boats longer than you've been operating a lawnmower. Bill, Karen's eyes narrowed. That's enough. We'll let law enforcement handle this. She pulled out her phone with dramatic flair, turning slightly so the gathered neighbors could see her dialing. By now, there were at least 15 people scattered along the shoreline path, some openly filming, others pretending to be out for a casual walk, but clearly lingering for the show. 911. Yes, this is an emergency, she said loudly. We have an individual launching a watercraft without authorization in a restricted area. Yes, the HOA has issued multiple warnings. We need officers dispatched immediately. She paused, her eyes locked on mine, then added for effect. Yes, I believe he's a danger to the environment and public safety. The smugness in her tone was thick enough to cut with a knife. She ended the call and slid her phone back into her cardigan pocket. They'll be here in minutes, she said, her voice dropping into that condescending register she used when she thought she'd already won. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. 5 minutes later, the distant wail of sirens rolled over the lake, bouncing off the water like an approaching storm. Karen straightened her posture, smoothed her blazer, and glanced around to make sure everyone was watching. When the 2 patrol cars pulled up, she was already walking toward them, clipboard in hand, her stride confident. Officers, she called. Over here. This man is... That's when I stepped off the dock, leather badge, wallet in hand. The sunlight caught the gold letters as I flipped it open. State Marina Inspector. The lead officer's expression shifted instantly from polite detachment to professional respect. Inspector Harris, he said, nodding. Didn't know you were working today. Unofficial capacity, I replied smoothly. But I do have active credentials and a matter that requires immediate attention. Karen froze mid-step. Wait, what? He's not. I turned toward her. Karen, I've been polite for weeks. I've listened to your made-up rules, your threats, and your theatrics. But what you've been doing isn't just harassment. It's illegal. The officers exchanged a glance. Illegal how, one of them asked. I handed over the folder I'd been keeping copies of my deed, the HOA charter clauses proving they had no jurisdiction over private docks, the county regulations, and, for the finale, the printed notice of violation from 3 years ago with Karen's name in bold letters. This, I said, tapping the page, is a record of unpermitted dock modifications to the community property, done under Karen's direction. I inspected the site 2 days ago, same violations still present. That's a breach of state and county regulations. Karen's face flushed deep red. That's not relevant. It's relevant, I said, because while you've been trying to shut down lawful private launches, you've been running an unpermitted, unsafe structure on public water. The officers didn't waste time. One of them stepped aside and made a quick call. A minute later, he turned back. County's sending an enforcement officer. In the meantime, ma'am, I'm going to need you to move your vehicle. You're obstructing public access. Karen sputtered. You can't. Now, the officer said, his tone flat. The murmurs from the crowd were like ripples spreading across the lake. I caught snippets. Did you hear that? She's in trouble now. Guess she picked the wrong guy. As Karen reluctantly got back into her SUV, I couldn't help but notice how different her movements were from when she'd arrived. Gone was the strut, the poise. She didn't even make eye contact with the neighbors as she drove off. And I wasn't done yet, because this wasn't just about winning an argument. This was about making sure the entire community understood exactly where the real authority came from, and it wasn't from a pastel cardigan with a clipboard. After the officers left and the crowd dispersed, I stood alone on my dock for a long moment, letting the quiet settle over the water again. The breeze tugged at the bow line, rocking the boat gently, as if reminding me that I'd won a battle but not the war. Karen might have been rattled, But people like her don't go quietly. They regroup. They scheme. And if I knew her, she'd already be working on a way to spin what had just happened so she didn't look like the fool she was. That meant I had to finish this, not just for me, but for every neighbor she'd steamrolled over the years. Step 1 was locking down my legal standing beyond any possible doubt. The deed, the HOA charter clauses, the county regulations, they were solid. But solid wasn't enough. I wanted irrefutable. So I called Daniels at the State Marina Enforcement Office. "Tom," he said, "I've got your photos and the violation records. You want us to send a full inspection team." "That's exactly what I want," I said. "And I want them here on the same day. Karen's expecting to catch me launching." He chuckled, setting a stage. Just making sure the truth gets the audience it deserves. We agreed on a date 3 days out. That would give me time to quietly let the word slip that I was planning a defiant launch, just enough to bait Karen into showing up in full force again. Step 2 was securing my witnesses. I stopped by Jim's house that afternoon, leaning on his fence while he watered his flowers. "Hey," I said casually, "you busy Thursday morning?" He eyed me warily. "Why?" "Because I could use someone to keep an eye on things while I launch. Someone who's not afraid to speak up if the story starts getting twisted." Jim smirked. "You planning fireworks, something better." I said, "The truth, in front of the right people." By the end of the day, I'd lined up 3 neighbors I trusted: Jim, the retired firefighter down the street, and Mrs. Collins, a sweet older woman who'd lived here 30 years and had no love for the HOA's strong-arm tactics. Step 3 was my own preparation. The morning before the launch, I gave the boat a final check, fuel topped off, safety gear in place, everything spotless. I pulled my inspector badge from its case and gave the leather a quick polish. It wasn't about vanity, it was about presentation. When you're going to dismantle someone's false authority, you do it with professionalism they can't match. I also made sure my folder of evidence was neatly organized, not just Karen's violation records, but printouts of the regulations, photos, and a written statement of events. If things went sideways, I wanted to be able to hand it to any official on the scene and let the facts speak for themselves. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't nerves. It was anticipation, the same feeling I used to get before a big enforcement operation back in my working days. All the planning, all the little details coming together for one decisive moment. Thursday morning arrived clear and bright. The lake shimmered like glass, and the air was filled with the hum of distant outboard motors. I parked my truck at the top of the driveway, the boat hitched and gleaming. Sure enough, just as I'd hoped, Karen took the bait. By 9:30, her SUV appeared on the shoreline path, this time accompanied by 2 other vehicles. The entire HOA board, it seemed, had decided to witness my rule-breaking. They gathered near the edge of my property, whispering among themselves, glancing at the boat like it was a ticking bomb. I went about my business as if they weren't even there, guiding the boat down the ramp, securing the lines, double-checking the motor. "Tom," Karen called out, her voice carrying over the water, "you've been warned. This will be documented, and you will face consequences." I didn't even look up. "Good morning to you too, Karen." And then, right on schedule, a white state enforcement truck rolled into view, followed by 2 county vehicles. 4 officials stepped out, Daniels among them, wearing high-visibility vests and carrying clipboards. The shift in the crowd's energy was instant. Neighbors stopped pretending to be on morning strolls. Even the HOA board members stiffened, uncertain. Daniels walked straight past Karen without so much as a glance and met me at the dock. "Inspector Harris," he said for the benefit of the audience, "we're here for that follow-up you requested." "Perfect timing," I said, shaking his hand. Karen blinked. "Follow-up? What follow-up?" Daniels turned to her, his tone brisk. "Ma'am, we're conducting an inspection of the community dock and related facilities. You'll need to provide access." Her mouth opened and closed twice before she managed. "But we're here about him launching without authorization. That's not within HOA jurisdiction." Daniels interrupted flatly. "We've already reviewed his documentation. Everything is in compliance." The crowd murmured. Cameras came out. Karen's face flushed crimson, but she tried again. "This is harassment." Daniels raised an eyebrow. Harassment is knowingly filing false complaints about lawful activities, ma'am. Now, about those unpermitted modifications. As he led his team toward the community dock, Karen followed, sputtering, her control over the situation slipping with every step. I stayed by my boat, calm and collected, watching years of her intimidation tactics begin to crumble under the weight of actual authority. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about showing the entire neighborhood what happens when someone tries to rule through fear instead of facts. And in less than an hour, everyone was going to see the final act. Daniels didn't waste any time. The moment his boots hit the planks of the community dock, he crouched down to inspect the woodwork, tracing his fingers along the grain of the boards. From where I stood at my own dock, I could hear the faint clink of his measuring tape and the scrape of a screwdriver as he checked the bolts. The neighbors drifted closer, drawn by curiosity like moths to a porch light. Even those who had been neutral before were whispering now, their eyes darting between Daniels and Karen. Karen followed the inspection team like a shadow, still clutching her clipboard as if it were a shield. "You can't just barge in here without notice," she protested. "This is private community property." Daniel straightened, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, this dock connects directly to public water, which places it under state jurisdiction. We have full authority to inspect it at any time without prior notice." The words landed like stones in a pond, sending ripples through the crowd. I saw Mrs. Collins press a hand to her mouth, barely hiding her smile. One of the county officials walked up to Daniels holding a clipboard. "No permits on file for the last modifications, and the electrical wiring is exposed under the decking." Daniels nodded gravely. "Document it. Photos, measurements, the works." Karen's face was turning a deeper shade of red with each passing second. "This is ridiculous. That extension was necessary for community enjoyment, necessary or not." Daniels cut in. "State law requires proper permitting and inspection. You didn't get either." Bill Simmons, the so-called HOA enforcer, stepped forward in a last-ditch attempt to save face. "Look, can't we just handle this internally? No need to make a scene." Daniels turned to him, his tone as cold as the lake in January. "The scene was made the moment your HOA started filing false complaints against a lawful property owner while operating an unsafe public structure." A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone behind me muttered, "About time." I decided that was my cue. I walked up to the edge of the gathering, badge still visible on my chest, and addressed Daniels loud enough for everyone to hear. "For the record," I said, "I attempted to resolve this matter quietly. I provided documentation to the HOA weeks ago showing my rights to launch from my own dock. Instead, I was met with repeated harassment, public defamation, and obstruction of public facilities." Daniels gave a slow nod. "And you were correct to contact us. The violations here are significant. We'll be issuing a formal citation and a compliance order." Karen spun toward me, her eyes blazing. "You think you've won something here? Tom, this community will remember." "Oh, I hope they do," I interrupted, my voice steady. "I hope they remember that rules apply to everyone, even the ones writing the newsletters." There was a beat of silence before the first neighbor clapped, then another. Within seconds, a small wave of applause rolled through the crowd. It wasn't raucous, but it was enough to make Karen's jaw tighten even further. One of the county officers approached her with a clipboard. "Ma'am, I need your signature acknowledging receipt of the violation notice." She hesitated, glancing around like she might find an escape route in the crowd, but there was none. With a tight-lipped scowl, she scribbled her name. Daniels turned back to the group of onlookers. "For anyone concerned, this inspection is strictly about the safety and legality of the community dock. Private property owners launching from their own docks, as long as they follow state regulations, are fully within their rights." The message couldn't have been clearer. The myth of Karen's absolute authority over the lake had just been shattered in front of everyone. As the officials wrapped up their work, Karen retreated toward her SUV, flanked by the silent, pale-faced HOA board members. She didn't look at anyone, didn't speak a word, just climbed in, slammed the door, and drove off in a spray of gravel. When the enforcement trucks pulled away, the energy in the neighborhood shifted. Neighbors I barely knew came over to shake my hand. Jim clapped me on the shoulder with a grin. "Well, That was worth the price of admission. Mrs. Collins leaned in conspiratorially. She's been bullying people here for years. I think you just ended it. I smiled, but I wasn't gloating. It wasn't about humiliation, though. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy the poetic justice. This was about restoring balance, about making sure no one in this community had to walk on eggshells anymore. As the sun began to dip toward the far shore, I returned to my own dock. The lake was calm again, the drama replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the hull. I untied the bowline, stepped aboard, and eased the boat out into the open water. No one stopped me. No one called 911. From the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a few neighbors watching from their porches, some waving. This time, the smiles were genuine. I opened the throttle just enough to feel the boat surge forward, the cool spray hitting my face. Out here, away from the noise and the power plays, the water felt exactly like it should free. And for the first time since moving to Clearwater Shores, I felt like it was truly mine to enjoy. Karen's reign had ended, but the real satisfaction came from knowing I hadn't just won for myself, I'd won for everyone who'd been too intimidated to stand up before. And I had a feeling she wouldn't be showing up at my dock with a clipboard ever again. The week after the inspection felt like living in an entirely different neighborhood. Gone were the constant notes taped to my door, the point glares when I walked to the mailbox, and the subtle us versus him energy that had been hanging in the air. The community, which had felt fractured for months, seemed to exhale. People lingered longer at the shoreline, chatted at the mailboats, and even smiled when they passed my property. Karen. She was nowhere to be seen. Her SUV didn't make its usual patrols up and down the streets. The HOA emails stopped coming entirely. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that the official notice went out. Karen Whitmore had resigned as HOA president. The message was short, formal, and as flavorless as a plain cracker. But it didn't need embellishment. The absence of her name from any letterhead spoke volumes. The new HOA leadership was a breath of fresh air. Jim told me that the board had quietly voted her out before she resigned, fearing further legal fallout from the dock violations. With her gone, the new president, a mild-mannered retired school principal named Linda, started holding open forums instead of closed-door meetings. Rules were reviewed with community input, and suddenly governance stopped feeling like a private fiefdom. On the water, life returned to normal or better. I launched my boat whenever the weather and my mood aligned, sometimes for early morning fishing trips, other times just to cruise the lake at sunset. Instead of side eyes, I got waves from kayakers, nods from pontoon captains, even the occasional, "Beautiful day for it," Tom shouted across the water. One evening, while tying off after a long afternoon on the lake, Mrs. Collins ambled down the path with a plate covered in foil. "Figured you could use some of my pecan pie," she said, handing it over with a knowing smile. "You've done more for this neighborhood in 1 month than some people did in years." I laughed. "I didn't do it for thanks, but I won't turn down pie." She winked. "Sometimes standing up for yourself is the best way to stand up for everyone." That sentiment stuck with me, because the truth was, I could have ignored Karen's antics, kept my head down, and just driven to another ramp each time I wanted to launch. It would have been easier in the short term, but it also would have meant letting her brand of petty tyranny go unchecked, not just for me, but for every person here. And I've learned over the years that when you let someone like that take an inch, they'll always come for the mile. The county eventually followed through on Daniel's inspection. The community dock was closed for 6 weeks while unpermitted modifications were removed and repairs brought it up to code. The work was funded not by increased HOA dues, but by a settlement Karen had to pay after the state threatened further enforcement action. Word was, she sold her house quietly and moved to another town. I couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for her to start pulling the same stunts there, and whether her new neighbors would be ready for her. By midsummer, Clearwater Shores felt like the place I'd hoped it would be when I first moved in. My deck became a gathering spot for coffee in the mornings. The Friday night potlucks returned, this time with laughter that didn't have an edge to it. One particularly golden evening, I sat on the end of my dock, watching the water turn molten orange in the sunset, and thought about the strange chain of events that had brought us here. It had started with a woman trying to control something that wasn't hers to control, and ended with a community learning that the loudest voice isn't always the one worth following. For me, personally, it was a reminder of something I'd learned long before retiring. Knowledge is power, but only if you're willing to use it. I'd spent decades enforcing maritime rules, but it wasn't the badge that stopped Karen, it was the preparation, the patience, and the decision not to be bullied into silence. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about winning an argument or proving a point. It's about drawing a line that says, this far, no further. It's about protecting the space you've worked for, whether that's a home, a hobby, or a way of life. Bullies, whether they're on the playground or running an HOA, thrive on silence and compliance. The moment you meet them with knowledge, facts, and the courage to act, you change the balance. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: don't underestimate the quiet power of knowing your rights. It's not about being confrontational, it's about being confident. Because when you stand firm, you're not just defending yourself, you might be giving others the courage to stand, too. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor, a boss, or even a family member who tried to overstep their bounds? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community, because there are plenty more stories where this one came from.